The first scream cut through the falling snow so sharply that it made everyone stop and look at once. It wasn't just loud, it was angry, sharp, and full of panic all at the same time. I had stepped outside to clear a small path in my driveway when I heard it echo across the street. When I turned, I saw Karen standing in the middle of the road, arguing with two police officers who had just arrived. But what happened next made everything worse. The snowstorm had been getting stronger for hours. The wind pushed thick sheets of snow across the street, covering the ground faster than anyone could clear it. Streetlights flickered through the heavy snowfall, and the flashing red and blue lights from the police car reflected across the houses like warning signals. Karen was already shouting before the officers even got out of their car. I could see one of the officers raising his hand slightly, trying to calm her down. His voice sounded steady and controlled, even from a distance. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't yelling. He was trying to explain something. But Karen wasn't listening. She kept talking over him, her voice getting louder with every word. She pointed back toward her house, then toward the sidewalk, then at the snow piled near the curb. It was hard to understand exactly what she was saying, but it was clear she was upset about something. I stayed near my driveway, watching. A few neighbors began opening their doors, standing just inside to see what was happening. The storm made everything feel tense. The cold air, the wind, the flashing lights, and Karen's voice all mixed together into one strange, uncomfortable scene. One officer tried again to calm her down. He stepped a little closer and spoke slowly, like he was trying to help her understand. For a second, I thought she might finally listen. But instead, she stepped closer to him. Her hands were moving fast as she spoke. Her voice got sharper, louder, more frustrated. It no longer sounded like she was asking for help. It sounded like she was arguing. And then, right there in the middle of the snow-covered street, Karen started fighting with the very officers who had come to calm her down. That was the moment I realized this night was about to turn into something no one expected. The wind picked up again, pushing snow across the street in thick waves as Karen continued shouting. The two officers stood firm in front of her, their posture calm but alert. One of them kept his hands slightly raised, not in defense, but in a quiet attempt to keep the situation from getting worse. Karen didn't slow down. She kept talking over them, her voice sharp and fast. From where I stood, I could see her pointing toward the sidewalk, then back toward her house, then at the snow piled near the road. Whatever she was upset about, it clearly meant a lot to her. The officer closest to her spoke again, his voice steady and patient. Even through the storm, I could hear him asking her to calm down so they could understand what happened. For a second, Karen went quiet. It almost looked like she was finally going to listen. But then she shook her head and stepped forward again, her boots crunching hard against the icy road. She started talking even louder than before, her words coming out fast and heated. She looked frustrated, like she wasn't being heard, even though the officers were doing everything they could to stay calm. A few more neighbors stepped outside now, standing on their porches or near their doors. No one wanted to get too close, but everyone was watching. The flashing lights painted the snow red and blue, making the whole scene feel even more intense. The second officer tried speaking this time. He kept his tone low and calm, asking her simple questions. From the way he nodded, it seemed like he was trying to piece together what had happened before they arrived. But Karen didn't answer clearly. She kept repeating the same complaints, her voice rising higher with every sentence. Then she suddenly pointed across the street, right toward my driveway. For a moment, I froze. I wasn't sure why she was pointing at me, but I could see both officers turn in my direction. One of them glanced at me briefly, then back at Karen, trying to understand what she meant. Karen kept talking, her voice filled with frustration, as if she was explaining that someone had caused the problem before the police got there. The officer closest to her tried once more to calm her down, asking her to take a breath. But instead of calming down, she stepped even closer to him. And that's when the situation started to feel like it might go too far. For a brief moment, everything felt still, as if the entire street was waiting to see what Karen would do next. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground and softening every sound, but the tension in the air was stronger than the storm itself. Karen stood just a step away from the officer now. He remained calm, his hands still raised slightly, his voice low and steady. He wasn't trying to argue with her. He was trying to slow things down, to understand what had happened before the situation got out of control. But Karen wasn't slowing down. She kept talking, her voice filled with frustration. She pointed back toward the sidewalk, then at the road, and finally toward my driveway again. I could feel my heart beating faster as both officers turned to look in my direction. One of them gave me a brief nod, almost like he was asking silently if I knew what was going on. I didn't move. I just stood there, unsure if I should step forward or stay where I was. Karen continued explaining something quickly, her words coming out fast and sharp. From what I could make out, she was saying someone had been messing with the snow near her property. She sounded certain, like she had already made up her mind about who was responsible. The officer closest to her spoke gently, asking her to slow down and tell him exactly what happened from the beginning. For a second, she paused. The storm howled softly around them, and the flashing lights reflected off the snow-covered street. It felt like the whole world had gone quiet just for that moment. Then she started talking again. This time, she pointed straight at me. I felt every eye turn in my direction. She claimed that someone had been pushing snow toward her driveway, blocking her path. She said she had tried to clear it, but it kept coming back. And then she said she believed I was the one doing it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The officers looked at me again, not accusing, just waiting. The first officer finally stepped slightly to the side and gestured for me to come closer. And as I took a slow step forward into the falling snow, I realized I was about to be pulled right into the middle of Karen's argument. I stepped slowly into the street, the snow crunching under my boots as the cold wind pushed against my jacket. The flashing lights from the police car reflected across the ground, making the moment feel even more intense. Karen watched me closely, her expression tight and full of frustration. The officer turned toward me calmly and asked if I knew anything about the snow being pushed toward her driveway. His voice was steady, not accusing, just trying to understand what was going on. I shook my head slowly and told him I had only been clearing my own driveway for the past hour. Karen immediately spoke over me. She insisted she had seen snow being moved in her direction and claimed it couldn't have happened on its own. Her voice rose again, sharp and frustrated, like she was trying to prove something before anyone could question her story. The second officer stepped slightly closer, keeping his tone calm. He asked her to give me a chance to speak. For a brief second, Karen went quiet, but the tension in her posture didn't disappear. I explained that the wind had been strong all evening. Snow had been blowing across the street, piling up along the curb and near every driveway. I pointed toward the road, where fresh drifts were already forming again just minutes after being cleared. The officer nodded slowly as he listened. Karen shook her head and crossed her arms tightly. She looked convinced that what she believed was true, no matter what anyone said. The snow kept falling around us, covering our footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. The first officer tried again to calm her down. He spoke gently, explaining that in heavy storms, snow often shifts and piles up in unexpected ways. He said they would take a look at the area and try to understand what was happening before making any conclusions. But Karen didn't like that answer. She stepped forward again, her voice rising once more. She said no one was taking her seriously. She said she had called for help, and instead, she felt like she was being ignored. The officer raised his hand slightly, asking her to stay calm. And that was the moment her frustration turned into something more intense. Instead of listening, Karen began arguing with the officers again, louder than before. Karen's voice grew louder as the wind pushed fresh snow across the street. The officer closest to her stayed calm, speaking slowly, trying to keep the situation from getting worse. He explained again that they were only trying to understand what had happened and that no one was accusing anyone. But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She kept repeating the same things, her words coming out fast and sharp. She said she knew what she had seen. She said she wouldn't have called the police if it wasn't serious. Her frustration filled the quiet street, making every moment feel heavier. The second officer glanced around, taking in the snow-covered road and the growing drifts near the sidewalks. It was clear the storm was strong enough to move snow on its own. But Karen continued arguing, her voice rising with every sentence. A few more neighbors had stepped outside now. Some stood near their doors, others just watched from their porches. No one spoke, but everyone could hear everything clearly. The flashing lights from the police car reflected off the snow, making the scene look tense and unreal at the same time. The first officer tried again. He told Karen they understood she was upset, but shouting wouldn't help fix the problem. He asked her to take a breath and explain calmly what she wanted them to do. For a moment, she stopped talking. But then she shook her head and stepped even closer to him. Her hands moved as she spoke, her voice sharp and emotional. She said no one was taking her seriously. She said she was tired of dealing with the same problem every winter. The officer nodded, still calm, still patient. But the tension in the air was changing. Karen pointed toward the snow piled near her driveway again. She said someone had to be responsible. She insisted it wasn't just the wind. Her voice echoed through the quiet street, mixing with the sound of the storm. Then, suddenly, she stepped too close to the officer. He didn't react harshly. He simply stepped back slightly and asked her to give him space. That simple request seemed to make her even more upset. She raised her voice again, arguing louder than before. And in that moment, it felt like things were about to get out of control. The snow kept falling harder, covering the street in a thick white layer as Karen continued raising her voice. The officer in front of her stayed calm, keeping a small distance between them, his hands slightly raised in a peaceful gesture. He wasn't trying to argue. He was trying to keep everything from getting worse. But Karen seemed too frustrated to notice. She kept pointing toward her driveway, repeating that the snow hadn't piled up there on its own. Her voice carried across the street, sharp and emotional, as if she needed everyone to believe her. The wind pushed loose snow across the road, almost like it was proving the officer's point, but she didn't look at it. The second officer spoke gently, asking her again to take a breath and calm down so they could help her properly. His voice was steady and respectful, but firm enough to be heard over the storm. For a moment, Karen stopped talking. She looked from one officer to the other, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. It almost seemed like she might finally calm down. The entire street felt still as neighbors watched quietly from their doors and windows. But then she shook her head again. Her frustration came back even stronger. She said she felt like no one was listening to her. She said she had called for help and expected something to be done. Her voice grew louder, echoing across the snow-covered houses. The first officer took a slow step back, keeping his tone calm. He explained that they were listening. He said they just needed to understand what had happened before taking action. He pointed toward the street, showing how the wind was pushing snow into new piles every few minutes. Karen barely looked. Instead, she stepped forward again, her boots sliding slightly on the icy ground. She spoke louder, her words coming faster, like she was losing patience with every second that passed. The officer gently asked her once more to stay calm and keep some space. That simple request seemed to trigger something. Karen's voice rose even higher. She started arguing directly with him now, not about the snow anymore, but about how she felt she was being treated. And right there, in the middle of the storm, the argument with the officers became personal. The wind howled down the street as Karen's voice carried through the falling snow. What had started as a complaint about snow near her driveway had now turned into something completely different. She wasn't talking about the problem anymore. She was arguing with the officers themselves. The first officer remained calm, his posture steady and controlled. He spoke slowly, trying to keep the situation from getting worse. He explained that they were only trying to help and that no one was against her. But Karen didn't seem to hear him. She kept talking, her words sharp and emotional. She said she felt like no one was taking her seriously. She said she had called for help, and instead of fixing the problem, they were standing there questioning her. Her hands moved quickly as she spoke, her frustration growing with every second. The second officer tried again. He asked her to lower her voice and take a breath so they could understand what she needed. His tone was still calm, but there was a firmness in it now. He was trying to keep control of the situation without making it worse. For a moment, Karen fell silent. The snow continued falling around them, covering the street and the sidewalks. The flashing lights from the police car reflected off the fresh snow, making the scene feel tense and unreal. Neighbors stood quietly on their porches, watching everything unfold. Then Karen spoke again, but this time, her voice was louder than before. She stepped closer to the officers, her face tight with anger. She said she was tired of being ignored. She said she shouldn't have to keep explaining the same thing over and over. Her words came out fast, like she was trying to prove something. The first officer raised his hand slightly, asking her to step back and calm down. He didn't shout. He didn't move toward her. He just asked for space. But instead of stepping back, Karen started arguing even more. She said she wasn't doing anything wrong. She said she had every right to be upset. Her voice echoed across the street, mixing with the sound of the storm and the hum of the police car. And in that moment, it was clear that what had started as a simple call for help had turned into a direct confrontation. The snowstorm showed no signs of slowing as Karen's voice continued to rise above the sound of the wind. The officers stood their ground, calm and steady, trying to bring the situation back under control. But it was clear now that this was no longer just about snow in her driveway. It had become something much bigger. Karen stepped forward again, her boots slipping slightly on the icy road. She looked frustrated and exhausted at the same time, like the entire situation had built up inside her and was now pouring out all at once. Her hands moved as she spoke, her voice sharp and emotional. The first officer spoke calmly, asking her one more time to take a breath and lower her voice. He explained that they were there to help, but they needed her to stay calm so they could understand what she needed. For a brief moment, she stopped. Her breathing was heavy, and she looked around at the street, the snow, and the neighbors watching from a distance. It almost seemed like she was realizing how big the scene had become. But then she shook her head again. She said she felt like no one believed her. She said she had been dealing with the same issue every winter and was tired of it. Her voice grew louder again, and the frustration returned just as strong as before. The second officer spoke, his tone firmer now. He told her that they understood she was upset, but arguing and stepping too close wasn't helping the situation. He asked her to step back and keep some distance so everyone could talk calmly. That simple request seemed to change the moment. Karen looked at him, clearly unhappy. For a second, it felt like she might argue again. The wind pushed snow across the street, and the flashing lights from the police car reflected off the icy ground. The entire street felt tense. Then, slowly, she stepped back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The officers relaxed slightly, their posture softening just a little. The tension that had been building all night started to ease, even if only a little. And for the first time since they arrived, it felt like the situation might finally calm down. But just as things started to settle, Karen said something under her breath that changed the mood all over again. The wind carried Karen's quiet words just enough for the officers to hear them. Whatever she said wasn't loud, but it was enough to bring the tension right back into the moment. The first officer turned slightly toward her, his expression still calm, but more serious now. He spoke gently, asking her to stay calm and keep the conversation respectful. Karen stood there for a second, looking down at the snow-covered ground. Her shoulders rose and fell as she took a slow breath. The anger that had filled her voice earlier seemed to be fading, replaced by something quieter and more tired. The snowstorm had softened too. The wind wasn't as strong now, and the falling snow felt slower, almost peaceful compared to the chaos from earlier. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the white street, making the moment feel calm again. The second officer spoke in a steady voice. He explained that they understood she was frustrated and upset. He said winter storms can make small problems feel bigger, especially when people are already stressed. But he reminded her that they were there to help, not to argue. Karen didn't respond right away. She stood quietly, looking from one officer to the other. Then she glanced toward her driveway, where the snow had already begun piling up again. It was clear that the wind was still pushing it around, just like before. For the first time that night, she didn't shout. She spoke in a much softer voice, saying she was just tired of dealing with the same issue every winter. She said she felt like no one ever listened when she tried to explain the problem. The officer nodded slowly, understanding. He explained that sometimes storms make everything feel worse than it really is. He told her they would take a quick look around the area to make sure everything was safe, but that the snow moving around was likely just the weather. Karen gave a small nod. The tension that had filled the street finally began to fade. The officers turned and walked back toward their car, their boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. The flashing lights slowly dimmed as the engine started again. One by one, neighbors stepped back inside their homes. And as the police car drove away into the snowy night, it was clear that what started as a call for help had turned into an argument she never meant to have.
Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. In the midst of the blizzard, the police tried to calm her, but in a moment everything flipped. She didn't just argue, she ended up fighting with the police themselves. In the end, what happened left everyone stunned. If you enjoyed don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments.